So good evening. My name is Christina Hildebrand. I am the founder and president of A Voice for Choice Advocacy. We are a 501c4 in California that educates and advocates for informed choice and transparency of what goes into your body. So we want you to know what's in it, and then you get to make the choice of whether you put it in or not. And that applies to pharmaceuticals, food, air, water, all sorts of things. We want you to make an informed decision and for the information to be transparent in doing so. So let's get started. So I wanted to go through this evening the legislative process, how that works, and also the bills that have been introduced this year already in California and those bills that we're anticipating being introduced and what you can do about them now. So A Voice for Choice Advocacy, as I mentioned, we're a 501c4. We do have a sister organization, A Voice for Choice, which is a 501c3. And over the past 7 years, so since 2015, A Voice for Choice Advocacy has established itself as the leading legislative organization lobbying in the California Capitol for your health rights. We've taken a position on many vaccine legislation bills since 2015, including SB 277, SB 276, SB 714, and there are a few others in there. We were able to defeat SB 18, which was the Children's Bill of Rights. Don't believe that name of it because it wasn't a Bill of Rights for children. It was basically an anti-parent bill. And we have gotten significant amendments on a number of bills, including AB 992, which allowed parents to opt out of vaccines during home visits without discrimination. We've also worked with Assemblymember Christina Garcia in 2020 to get AB 1989, the Menstrual Products Right to Know Act, which labeled all ingredients on menstrual products in California. The same thing was done in the previous year in New York. And so as of next year, all menstrual products nationwide will likely be labeled. We currently have 2 lobbyists in the Capitol, but we hire, and I also go up to the Capitol, less so in COVID, but pre-COVID, I would go up every other week. Now, so much of it happens on Zoom calls, and we'll talk about that a little bit. All of this is overwhelming to people who have never lobbied before or never gone and talked to their legislators before. And so I wanted to go through tonight a little bit of background there about how to create a trusted and professional relationship with your legislators and know where to start and how to make that happen. So our state legislators are in Sacramento. We are one of the few states that has a year-round legislature. So our legislators show up in January and they go home in September, and then they are in their district in October and November. That's very different from other states. For example, Texas has a legislature in session for 3 months every other year. Other states have it some of them have it every year for a much shorter period of time. But we really have a working legislature. So this is their main job. They don't hold other jobs during the time that they are legislators, usually. We have 120 legislators in our Capitol. 40 of them are senators who have a 4-year term. 80 of them are assembly members who have a 2-year term. They split into those 2 houses, the Senate and the Assembly. You have one of each of those in your district. So you need to find out who those are. We'll go into how to do that. 70% of them are Democrats, which means we have a supermajority. It means that the Republicans that are in the legislature basically don't have to do anything and bills still get passed. So it is really hard to get bills passed by the Republicans, and it is really hard to stop bills that the Democrats want. Each legislature sits on many different committees. There are committees assigned to issues such as health, education, business, those types of things. The chair is always of the majority party, so in this case, a Democrat, and the vice chair is always of the minority party, in this case, a Republican. The rest of the committees, and I'll get into what those committees do in a little bit, but the rest of the committee members are split in the same proportion as that house, so as the Senate and as the Assembly. One thing to note is that it used to be you could go into our Capitol building, which is the beautiful building here on this slide. You used to go in there, and that was where all of our legislators and their staff had offices. That is no longer the case, at least for the next 4 years, because they are ripping down the annex, which is the piece behind that facade of the building. They are ripping that down because it is old, and they built a new space, swing space, on O Street between 10th and 11th. It's about a block from the south steps of the Capitol. And I was there on Monday. It is a beautiful building. It is seems completely empty because the legislators are mostly still working from home, or if they are there, they are not taking meetings in person at this time. Doesn't mean that isn't going to change, but it is a beautiful space and a beautiful building. That is where currently all of our legislators have their offices and their staff, and Governor Newsom has his offices on the top floor. So you have, as I mentioned, 2 legislators that are yours, that you, if you voted for, or you may not have voted for them, but they were voted in your district, your senator and your assembly member. Your senator is your state senator. That is not the same senator that goes to Washington, D.C. These are your senators that are going to Sacramento and the Capitol and the California legislature. Those senators and assembly members author bills to get them passed into law. They amend bills and they oppose bills. In order to find your legislator, you want to go to this website, where if you just type in "Find Your Rep California" in a search bar, this will come up. You type in your address. You don't have to put in your full address. You type in your address and it will show up, and it will show your assembly member and your senator. You can click on those links and they take you to their websites. Once you want to go to each of their websites. Once you get to their websites, you want to sign up for their newsletter or their district updates, so you know what they're up to, you know what's important to them, you know where you can go and find them if they have an event, those types of things. You also want to go to their site to research their interests and their passions. You want to know what makes them tick. What is it about your legislators that really they are passionate about? And usually there's something, whether it's education, whether it's the environment, whether it's homelessness, whatever it is, transportation, whatever it is, you want to work out what they are passionate about, because that's where you're going to relate to them on that issue. You also want to research their votes on previous vaccine legislation and education legislation. You want to do that because you want to know where they stood on that legislation. It's worth going and looking, if there are any videos of them speaking up on any of these issues, so that you can hear them speak and hear what their perspective is on them before you walk in the door, before you get to know them. And then the other piece is you want to find out who staffs their health and their education committees, because most of these bills, those are the committees that they are going to go through. The way the legislature works is we have about 3,000 bills, individual pieces of legislation that are introduced every single year in California. About 1,500 of those make it to the governor's desk, and then about probably 1,200, 300 actually get signed into statute. That is a huge number of bills. There's no other state that has that many bills that comes through. What that means is every single legislature is reading somewhere in proximity of 2,500 to 3,000 bills. Well, those legislators, your legislator is not reading those bills. They're not reading the language of the bills at all. They may do for their bills, and they may do for some that are really important to them, but for the most part, they have staffers assigned to every bill. So they'll have a staffer that is assigned to all the health bills. They have a staffer assigned to all the education bills or the business and professions bills. There may be some overlap. Some staffers may be assigned to more than one issue, but for the most part, health and education have separate staffers and individual staffers. And those staffers, it is up to them to read through the bills, to meet with organizations, to get an understanding of what the bill's all about, and then go and speak to the legislator, give them a summary, and let them know whether they should request amendments, whether there are certain questions they should be asking in committee, those types of things. So while meeting and getting a relationship with your senator and your assembly member is really important, those staffers are equally important. So the people that you meet in their office are really, really important to have a good relationship with as well. So one key thing to remember about your senator and assembly member is that they work for you. You were the one that voted in, or your district, other constituents in your district voted them in. You want to develop relationships, and this is really crucially important. You want to have good relationships. Even if you hate your senator and you don't like what they do, you want to build a relationship with them. Now, the one person that I would say that is not the case for in California is Senator Pan. You're not going to build any good relationship on a vaccine bill with Senator Pan. So if you're in Senator Pan's district, focus on your assembly member. But other than that, even if they are a legislator that has brought this legislation forward and you don't think you can get anywhere with them, still try and get a relationship with them, still try and meet with them, try and meet with their staff. You never know that it may be one thing that you say or one email that you send, or you may be at a, an event that they're at where suddenly they're listening to you and maybe they pick something up. You plant a seed that comes back at a later date to help you. So when you go into a meeting with your senator or your assembly member or their staff, you want to build a professional relationship. You don't want to go in there angry. You don't want to go in there aggressive. You want to have a professional relationship with them, even if you don't see eye to eye with them. You want to share things in common. So work out, do they have kids? Do they like to play soccer? Do they, what is it that they like to do? Both the assembly members and the senators, as well as the staff. Talk to them on that level first. Meet them where they're at. So listen to them. One of the most important things our first lobbyist said to me is, listen to what the legislators say. Let them talk. They like to talk. Let them talk, because you will find out so much about them if you allow them to share their perspective on the issues. You also want to assume that they already know a lot and that you're bringing something additional to the table. You basically want to become their go-to expert on the issue. So you want them to know that if you send them an email, whether it's the staffer or the legislator, you send them an email, they look at it and go, oh, that email's from Christina. I know she has good information, and she usually is, she may be on the other side of things, but she's usually got a pulse on things. You don't want to overload them with information. You want to give them sound bites, and you want to give them accurate, valid information. You can leave a flyer or a summary. I recommend against leaving, binders worth of information. We did that the first year. We did this in 2015, and I can promise you we handed out lovely binders, but very, very few legislators actually read the whole thing, or their staffers read the whole thing. You want to make it concise, and you want to make it bite-sized for them to take in. I will say that A Voice for Choice Advocacy and a number of other organizations that we work closely with will be putting out flyers, will be putting out fact sheets, those types of things. Those are all good to use as a basis for your meetings. The other key thing, as I mentioned, is you want to be professional. You want to address legislators by their appropriate titles. So Senator Wiener or Senator Pan, Senator, Assembly Member so-and-so. You want to say that because that's who they are. You want to respect them. You want to get respect from them. They will respect you much more if you address them in that way. The other piece is that you want to, if you're meeting them in person, you want to dress professionally. You want to dress in business casual attire. You want to really make an effort. You have to understand the people that you are competing with are lobbyists. If you walk into the Capitol and you see a lobbyist, you will know they're either a lobbyist or a legislator or their staffer, because they are all wearing suits and ties, and the women are, in business casual attire. It is a more formal setting. So if you go to meet with them, our recommendation is look nice. You don't have to be super nice and super dressed up. You don't have to wear a suit, but you do want to wear stuff that is professional looking and clean, and just be professional. Pretend you're going on a job interview, that type of level of attire. The other thing, that if you are meeting them in person, you will have to wear a mask. You cannot get into the Capitol or the Capitol buildings without a mask on. If you do not want to wear a mask, then do not go into the Capitol. You can have meetings over Zoom. Many of the legislators and their staff are only taking meetings over Zoom still this year. So request a meeting over Zoom then. You don't get the same, I know we all know this by now, but you don't get the same atmosphere in a Zoom meeting than if you're in person. Okay, I'm going to go for the next 2 slides. I'm going to go through the timeline of bills in California. This is a question that I get asked all the time. Okay, so these bills are introduced. Now, what do we do and how does it work? And so I am going to go through this process fully so that you understand the timing of each of these things. So between December and February 18th this year, it's usually mid-February, bills are introduced into the legislature. They are either introduced by senators or by assembly members. If they're introduced by the Senate, they have an SB before the bill number. And if they are introduced by the Assembly, they have an AB before the number. Once they are introduced, and you can find bills that have been introduced on a website called LegInfo, I think it's leginfo.ca.gov. But if you just search Leg Info, it will come up. You can search bills. You can search bills by the author, you can search bills by keywords, and you can search bills by their bill number. So bills get introduced between now and February 18th. When those bills get introduced, they have to sit for 30 days. So nothing happens for 30 days. So while these bills were introduced, so one of our vaccine bills was introduced last week, one of them was introduced on Monday, yesterday, and those bills will sit and nothing will happen to them for 30 days. Doesn't mean to say you get to take 30 days off between now and then. I'll get into what you need to do between now and then, but right now they are just sitting there. Nothing can happen. When bills get to the end of that 30 days, they get assigned to the Rules Committee. One of the key things, let me take a step back. So there are many bills that are introduced between now and February that are called spot bills. They are bills that have a name and then one sentence maybe. Those bills are placeholders. So every legislator can put in between 30 and 40 bills, and those are placeholders. They're basically saying, I've got a bill, but I don't have the language yet. I don't know what the exact language is. And so they put what's called a spot bill in, a placeholder in. Now, if that spot bill has a title or a subject or a name, it doesn't mean to say that has anything to do with what the final bill actually will be. So you may see something that says, public health initiative, and it turns out to be a transportation bill. So if you see a spot bill, and you'll know them because they're only a couple of lines long, or they look like they don't change anything in the statute other than maybe some pronouns, those are spot bills, and they will be amended and then put forward and move through the legislature. So once the bills are introduced, they sit and they go to the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee then assigns the bills to different committees. So each bill is assigned to committees that it relates to. So for example, SB 277 in 2015, that was the bill that removed the personal belief exemption from the vaccine requirements for school. That went to, in the Senate, it went to the Health Committee, it went to the Education Committee, and it went to the Judiciary Committee, because it affected all of those three things. Once it got over to the Assembly, and I'll talk about it going over, bills going over to the Assembly, but once it got to the other house, it only went to the Assembly Health Committee. What we have seen in the last 2 years over COVID is that the Rules Committee is assigning bills to only one committee. And because of COVID, because they don't want to have legislators in the same room for too long a time, they want to cut down that. So those bills that went to one committee, you could bring up issues from that related to a different committee in those committees. I am not sure what's going to happen this year, but my guess is that the vaccine bill, so even in 2019, prior to COVID, SB 276 only was assigned to one committee in the Senate and one committee in the Assembly. It should have been assigned to more, but they only wanted a mass showing up of us, our movement, on one day, and didn't want to have multiple days where we had masses of people in the Capitol. And so they restrained it by just sending it to one committee. There's nothing that you can do to get it to another committee other than a legislator or the chair of the committee it went to saying it should be re-referred to a different committee. That doesn't usually happen. So when it goes through, if it passes through the committee, so for example, if it's assigned to the Health Committee and it passes through the Health Committee, it needs a majority vote to pass through. It then goes to either another committee or it goes to the Appropriations Committee if it has a fiscal impact. So if there is any monetary budget impact, then it will go to the Appropriations Committee, and it actually sits there. It sits there until all the bills have passed through the committees, and then the Appropriations Chair looks at all of those bills and says, okay, here are all the bills that need money. Here's the amount of money that they each need, and here's the amount of budget we have, and we're moving through these bills. And it's a place that bills fall off, usually not in the first house, because in the first house they haven't got the full budget and they're not sure, what they're doing monetarily, but definitely in the second house, a lot of bills fall off at the Appropriations Committee. And at that point, the bill goes to the Senate floor. If it was introduced in the Assembly, it would go to the Assembly floor. And at that point, the full Senate or the full Assembly votes on that bill. That happens in May. So we've got, as you can see, from March, probably beginning mid-March, we've got assembly committees and Senate committees happening during that time. And then in May, it goes to the Senate floor vote or the assembly floor vote. At that time, it needs a majority vote. So it needs at least 21 votes in the Senate and 41 votes in the assembly to pass through. A vote yes is a vote for it. A vote no is a no vote for it, but an abstention is also counted as a no vote. So when we ask legislatures for their no vote, what we actually ask them for is their no vote or their abstention. We don't care whether they vote on the bill or they vote no on, or they don't vote on the bill or they vote no on the bill. Those two count as the same thing. The key thing is we don't want them to vote yes on a bill that we're opposing. Once that happens, it goes through during June. Both the Senate and the Assembly are busy with the budget, and it does go through at that point, move to the other house. So any bills that started in the Assembly move over to the Senate. Any bills that started in the Senate move over to the Assembly. In July, they take a month break. So this year, it's from the 1st of July to the 1st of August. The legislators are not in Sacramento. They are either in their district or they're on vacation. When they come back is when the main committee votes happen in the other house. It gets assigned to a committee, it may be assigned to a different committee, it may be assigned to the same committee. So if it was in the Health Committee in the Senate, probably gets assigned to the Assembly Health Committee, but it may not. It may go to the Education Committee if there were amendments. I'll talk about amendments in a minute, but if there were amendments that happened that made it a different bill that is primarily the Education Committee, or it may go to multiple committees as well. Those committees, again, vote in the same way. It then goes to the Appropriations Committee if there is a financial piece to it. As I mentioned, it sits there again until all of the bills accumulate there. And then in 2 days, they basically vote through those bills that are going to keep going, and they fail, and the other bills fail to move through. At that point, the second house votes on it. The entire house vote, each of the houses vote on it. Again, we need a 21% majority to pass the bill in the Senate and a 41 majority in the Assembly to pass the bill. If it passes through the floor vote, it then goes to the governor's office, and he gets from September, this year it's September 1st, it's usually the first week in September, but from September 1st until September 30th to decide what he's going to do with those bills. Remember, he has about 1,500 bills that come to his desk at that time. He can do one of three things. He can sign the bill, which means it becomes law. He can veto the bill, which means it fails, which means that it goes back. It can go back to the legislature. And if the legislature can get a 2/3 vote on it, then they will, and want to do that, then it would pass into law. That happens very, very rarely because the legislators don't want to upend the governor and usurp him. And so they do it very, very strategically if it happens at all. The other thing that the governor can do is do nothing at all. If he does nothing, that bill gets put into statute. It becomes law as well. So it is not that if he does nothing, it goes away. It is that if he does nothing, it becomes law. So that is the timeline of the bills in California. I wanted to go through that so that you see sort of the process of where we're at. It is a long process. One of the things that I will say is that we are in this for a marathon every year. We're not in this for a sprint. So don't get worn out. It is a very exhausting roller coaster emotional ride. And I can tell you, I've been doing it for 7 years. There are so many people that get, even just halfway through and are just like, oh my God, I am so exhausted by this. It consumes you. Your family comes first. Your health comes first. This comes second. I understand this impacts your life greatly. Some of these bills may impact your life greatly if they are passed, but at the same time, you have to have the energy to make it to August or September. Okay, so key thing, know the status of your issue. So learn about the process to understand where your elected official is in the process. So right now, as I mentioned, we are at the start of the process. We've got 9 months to go. One of the key things that you need to know is your issue history. What is the current statute? What are the regulations? What are the bills that have passed, the bills that have failed, the bills that have been vetoed? Organizations that are in California that work hard on this have that information. A Voice for Choice Advocacy shares it. There are other organizations such as California Health Coalition Advocacy, PERC, California Health Defense. All of those are great organizations and have been doing this for a while. You want to know what the current bills are. I'm going to go through 2 of those, but we expect at least another 4 to come. You also want to know what amendment requests you want to have and what organizations are active on the bill. So what organizations are supporting the bill, what organizations are opposing the bill, and what organizations are trying to amend the bill. You want to know that because you want to align yourself with those organizations if you can. And the other piece is where do your 2 legislators sit on the bill? What is their perception of the bill? I will tell you that the majority of Republicans are against these vaccine bills, the COVID bills, and the majority of Democrats are for them. I would say that all of your legislators are for vaccines. So you also need to go in and talk to them from that perspective. You can't go in saying, anti-vax things or things against the vaccine because they have most likely all taken the vaccine. So the other question that I get is when do you oppose a bill and when do you amend a bill? So opposing a bill, 2015, we in California decided that we were going to beat SB 277, and that was the way it's going to be. And Washington and Oregon had beaten their bills, and so there was no reason why we weren't going to beat the bill. Unfortunately, in California, we have a very different legislative process to most other states, and it doesn't work the same way. The biggest piece of it is that we have a supermajority of Democrats, and it is really, really, really hard to stop a bill completely dead in its tracks, unless you are a powerful lobby organization, such as the California Medical Association, such as the California Teachers Association, such as the California Prison Guards Association. If you don't have millions of dollars and tens of lobbyists, it is incredibly hard to just stop a bill. Doesn't matter how many people you have on your side. We've had thousands of people up at the Capitol every single time one of these vaccine bills come up. The legislature has never, ever, and staffers have never, ever seen the number of people that we bring up there. It doesn't matter, unfortunately. So what have we learned over the years? A Voice for Choice Advocacy has learned over the years that just opposing a bill doesn't get you where you want to be, because that bill just flies through the legislature. It doesn't get amended. It just, whatever they start off with, it looks very similar by the end of it, because they haven't had anyone asking them questions or requiring them to think about what the bill does, or organizations saying, we want this change to the bill. So in order to stop a bill, you either need one of these strong lobbies or you need the votes. So the other option is our movement finds 40 legislators that are not willing to vote on the bill or willing to vote no on the bill in the Assembly, or 20 legislators in the Senate that are not going to vote on the bill or not or abstain from the bill. That is hard to do. Okay, the other piece of this is you think you have a vote, and what we have found is we would go into a legislature's office. They would say, oh, you've got some really good points there. Yeah, I'm going to hold off the bill. I'm not going to vote on the bill. I'm not going to vote yes on the bill. The following day, they go and vote on the bill and they vote yes on the bill. And we go back to them and we're like, what happened? And they say, well, I know you had good questions and good concerns with the bill, but, the CMA, California Medical Association, came in last night with their doctors and they answered all the questions. They said it was not a problem. Don't worry about that. It's all taken care of in the bill. And so I decided to vote yes on the bill. None of the things were taken care of, but the CMA smooth talked them. And so they voted yes on the bill. So it is really, really hard to stop a bill outright. Amending a bill is much easier. We realized this in 2017, 16, 17. There were bills that were being put forward and we opposed them. We didn't want them to move forward. But what we realized is if we suggested amendments to the author and we said, these are our concerns, could you change this language to this? They said, oh, well, that's interesting. Yeah, we would consider that. And some of them picked it up, some of them didn't. We got some amazing amendments on some bills, which basically just cut out the harshness of those bills from our perspective. It doesn't mean to say that we agreed with the bill in general, but from our perspective, just changing the bill is more amenable. I can promise you the vaccine work group, and I'll go into them in a little bit, but the vaccine work group that's putting forward these vaccine bills is not going to, their goal is to have the bill get to the governor's desk in September. Their goal isn't for their bill to be stopped. So they're going to do absolutely everything they need to in order to get some form of that bill on the governor's desk in September. Saying that we should just stop bills doesn't work. It's not there. They will keep going. I can guarantee you they will keep going. And so our perspective, and many of the other organizations in California that have been doing this for a while, is that amending bills is the way to go. So you can either ask an organization or a constituent can ask a legislator directly to amend a bill, or you can have another legislator ask that legislator for an amendment to the bill. So for example, if you went to your legislator and said, you know, I really have problems with this bill, I would like these amendments to be made. This is why I think these amendments are important. Would you please ask Senator whoever, Assembly member whoever, to make these amendments to the bill? And a legislator has more clout than an organization to go in and get it done. But legislators also want their bills to move forward. So if in a committee, there are enough legislators saying, you know, we really need this amendment made, then the legislator is likely to take those amendments because they know they can't get their bill moved forward without them. So it is usually done in committee. Amendments are usually done in committee. They're not done on the floor. The floor vote is really whatever the bill looks like when it gets to the floor, to the whole Senate or the whole Assembly floor vote is what usually gets voted on. There are times when bills get amended on the floor, but it just isn't likely. The time to amend a bill is when it is in committee or between committees, if either the committee can change it or the author can change it. Okay, I wanted to go over a little bit of vaccine history in California just to sort of so people have some history here. This is a brief history. I'm going to go actually one bill. I forgot to put a bill in here from 2010, I think it was, which was AB 499, which allowed the HPV and hepatitis B vaccine to be given to children without parental consent at the age of 12. It also basically allows any sexually transmitted disease vaccines, any sexually transmitted disease treatment, and abortions to be allowed of 12-year-olds and older without parental consent. So we do have that in statute already. We then had in 2012, AB 2109, which was a bill put forward by then Assembly Member Pan, which required parents to consult with and obtain a signature from a licensed healthcare provider in order to receive the personal belief exemption to vaccines for children, school children K through 12. Governor Brown added a signing note to add a religious exemption there, but only applied that to where the religion prohibited seeking of medical advice or treatment. So basically there was a religious exemption that was put on the form, the personal belief form, but it said that you basically wouldn't seek any medical treatment for religious reasons. For the most part, most of us, unless you're Christian Science, you do agree to medical treatment in life-saving, life-threatening conditions, those types of things. In 2015, we had SB 277, which removed all non-medical exemptions, including the religious beliefs exemption, which fell under a personal belief exemption. And then in 2019, we had SB 276 and SB 714, which basically at the beginning of January 2021, medical exemptions have to be based on strict CDC, ACIP, or AAP criteria. That legislation removed the medical exemption as well. From California, it requires a medical exemption to be submitted online, and doctors are just not willing to do that because they've been witch hunted and had their licenses revoked or disciplined because of writing medical exemption. So it is incredibly hard to get any type of exemption. I will say the one thing in 2015, SB 277 does allow children on an IEP that have special needs to go to school without having the vaccine requirements. So let's get into our bad bills for this year, 2022. We have the Legislative Vaccine Work Group that was announced by Senator Pan last week. There are, I believe, 7 members on the Legislative Vaccine Work Group, and they were brought forward in order to get rid of misinformation and bring forward bills that relate to vaccines and get more people vaccinated in California. We believe that there are 6 bills that they will bring forward. We used to think there were 5, but I do think based on the reading that I've done in the last week, I do believe there's a 6th one out there that's going to come down. These are bills for 2 of them that have been introduced. The 3rd one, we do know for sure that it will be introduced. The other 3 are we are not 100% sure. So the first one that was introduced last week is SB 866. It was introduced by Senator Wiener. I will go into more detail of these bills, but it allows 12-year-olds or older to consent to receive vaccines without parental consent. SB 871 was introduced by Senator Pan yesterday. It would require the COVID vaccine to attend in-person K through 12. It actually is greater than K through 12. It's actually daycare through 12, public or private school without a personal belief exemption. And it removes the personal belief exemption from future CDPH added vaccines, thereby allowing CDPH, which is the California Department of Public Health, to add any vaccine to the K through 12 school requirements without legislative action. The 3rd one that we know is going to be introduced by Assemblymember Aguilar-Curry is the HPV and meningitis vaccine being added to attend in-person public or private high school without a personal belief exemption. And then the next 3 we're not sure of, but the next 2 were proposed at the end of the last legislative session. The first one is the COVID vaccine mandates for all public and private employees, basically codifying what was the federal OSHA regulations. OSHA couldn't do it because they can't regulate over state vaccine requirements, but it can be done by the state. So basically the employees all employees in California would have to be vaccinated. That was proposed in the end of the last legislative session by Assemblymember Lowe. The next one on the list, the COVID vaccine mandate for patrons to enter certain establishment, that is a societal mandate similar to what we've seen in LA, San Francisco, Oakland, where you cannot go into certain places without being vaccinated and showing your vaccine card. That was proposed by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks at the end of the last legislative session. Both of those didn't go anywhere, thankfully, but we do anticipate them being brought forward. And then the last one is a bill that Senator Pan introduced in 2017. It didn't go anywhere at the time because the Newspaper Association was heavily against it, but it would prevent COVID-19 and vaccine misinformation. So those are the bills we're anticipating. As I said, there are 2 bills there that have been introduced and we have seen the text for, and I want to go through them in detail. So SB 866 is the minor consent to vaccination. It's Senator Wiener's bill, and it would remove parental consent and authorize a minor 12 years or older to consent to vaccines that meet specified federal agency criteria. The bill would authorize a vaccine provider as defined to administer a vaccine pursuant to the bill, but would not authorize the vaccine provider to provide any service that is otherwise outside the vaccine provider's scope of practice. I will go through what that means and break it down for you. But one thing to note, as I mentioned, AB 499 in California already allows 12-year-old minors to consent to vaccines for sexually transmitted diseases, such as HPV and Hepatitis B. So that's already in our statute. And then there are other states, such as Rhode Island and South Carolina, that allow a 16-year-old to consent to vaccines. Oregon allows 15-year-olds or greater. Alabama, 14-plus-year-olds. Washington, D.C. permits 11-year-olds to consent. So this is something that has already been passed in other states. So it's not unusual, but there are different age limits. So what does this bill mean? It has various pieces, but our concerns are it subverts parental decisions on medical treatment, which is very concerning. We're also concerned that 12-year-olds, so teenagers, their brain development is at a place where they are not thinking straight, if you want to put it that way, but they assess risk very differently, and they are overcome by peer pressure very often. That is part of the developmental stage of a 12 to 17-year-old. There's a lot of research, psychological research on it, and that is a concern. Our concern is that kids would get pressured or bullied into getting vaccinations, coerced into getting these vaccinations. Our other concern with the bill is that the last sentence here, that it would authorize a vaccine provider. So they're not allowed to administer any service outside of their vaccine scope of practice. So the majority of vaccine providers are pediatricians or pharmacists. Well, a pediatrician can do a lot more in their services than just give vaccinations. And so we are concerned that pediatricians or other, doctors would come in and, or like an OBGYN would say, yep, come in for your vaccine, and then give a whole slew of other treatments that are within their scope of practice, but not what the child went there to do. Again, I'm going to say, we are opposed to this bill, but we are suggesting amendments. And I've had a lot of, since we put an email out last week on this, I've had a lot of people email and say, I can't believe you're not just saying oppose the bill. If it were up to me, I would oppose the bill all day long, but it's not going to stop this bill, okay? And it doesn't matter whether other legislators are saying, oh, they don't have the votes for the bill, okay? Kevin Kiley, Assemblymember Kevin Kiley, came out with that statement. He said, Senator Pan has said that he doesn't have the votes, or the vaccine group has said that they don't have the votes for these bills. Number one, that's the vaccine group talking and Senator Pan talking. What is the narrative? Why are they saying that? Ask yourself. There's something fishy going on there. I'm going to tell you that. But the other piece of it is they may not have the votes now, but once the CMA comes around handing out their election money, I can promise you they have the votes. So if you want to sit back and just, allow them to say they don't have the votes, go for it. We're not going to be doing that. The other piece is if we oppose the bill, we are opposing the bill. Okay, so we're saying we are not in support of the bill. We are strongly opposing the bill, but we are asking for amendments because we believe if we can get these amendments, this set of amendments in, it waters down the bill and it gets us to a place where your children will be safe. Okay, so one of our changes is to change the age to a minor 16 years of older or older. So increase that age level. People say, well, why 16? Why are 16-year-olds okay? If we go to 18, we are just opposing the bill. That's what the statute says right now. So we are bringing it down to 16. I honestly am going to say to you as parents, if you have a child 12 and up, if you have a child and you have not talked to them about getting vaccinated and you don't want them to be vaccinated, you need to start tomorrow morning because your child will be coerced. If your 16-year-old wanted to get the COVID vaccine, they would be able to get the COVID vaccine without your consent. Okay, so you need to be talking to your children about this. You need to be telling them if they have vaccine clinics at school, it's okay to walk out of there. It's okay to scream and kick and say no to getting the vaccine. You need to be educating your kids, okay? It doesn't matter what this law says, you need to educate your kids. But going to go back to our amendment is to change it to 16. A 16-year-old should have had, should be able to say yes or no. And if we go any higher than that, we're, at just opposing the bill. We want to make sure that all efforts are made to contact the parents prior to vaccination. So while the child may be able to consent, parents have to be tried to be contacted. If they go to all efforts and they can't contact the parents, then the child gets to make that decision or gets to sign on the consent form. It would require the vaccine provider to obtain complete medical history and conduct a physical exam and evaluation of the child. This is based on what our doctors are required to do for the medical exemption. So if you want a medical exemption to a vaccine, the doctor has to conduct a full history of that child. So we want them doing the same thing before they go out and get the vaccine. It would also, one of the things that we have in here is that they obtain the complete medical history. So if they're not the child's pediatrician, that they actually go and find the child's medical history so that if the child has had reactions in the past, they're aware of those reactions, even if the child isn't aware of them. It would require the non-parental consenting minor to be vaccinated in a physician's office, not as a school clinic, a mass vaccination site, pharmacy, reproductive care clinic, or other location. We really want the kids to be in physicians' offices so that they are not just pulled out of school and put in a school clinic or a mass vaccination clinic. It also makes it harder for the child to get vaccinated. It makes them think more about getting vaccinated and whether that's what they want to do without their parents present. We also are asking that they cannot be bribed, bullied, or coerced to getting a vaccination. So currently in the statute, it does say that when they're given vaccinations or they're required to school, they can in order to get those vaccines, your child can be coerced. So we were asking for that to be removed, and specifically saying that they can't be bribed with lottery tickets or boba or pizza or whatever it is, that you can't use those as a reason to get vaccinated. We asked that the parents are notified immediately after the vaccination. And then the other flip side of this is, so if you're going to allow children to consent to vaccination, they should also be able to decline vaccination without parental input. So this is for the children who have a parent that may be fully wanting them to get vaccinated, and the child has done their research and the child does not want to be vaccinated. So, where our perspective is, if you're going to allow the child to get a vaccine, you should also allow the child to make the decision not to get a vaccine. And then the last one is what I talked about in the first piece of this, is to not allow any other service than vaccination and the treatment of any reactions, adverse reactions to that vaccination. So those are our amendments. If you take all of those together and you were to put them in a bill, it makes the bill much more palatable. It makes it not 12-year-old and up child being just shoved into a school clinic and injected, not necessarily against their will, but not knowing any differently. The second bill that's been introduced is SB 871, which is the daycare to 12th grade COVID vaccine requirement, introduced by Senator Pan. This requires all children K through 12, it's actually daycare through 12 as it's currently written, that attend private and public school to get the COVID vaccine. It removes the personal belief exemption from future California Department of Public Health vaccines that are added, and allowing them to add basically any vaccine to the school requirements. And it also removes the hepatitis B 7th grade exemption. So let me go through those a little bit. So the COVID vaccine is being added to the list of, right now there are 10 diseases on the list. The COVID vaccine would become the 11th disease that would be required. There is no mention in the statute of how many vaccines would be required. Is it 2 vaccines? Is it a booster shot every year? There's nothing in that. All of that comes in regulation. So then once law is passed, the department that is in charge of that law, that statute, then puts out regulations, and they basically say, this is what needs to happen. So the fact for K through 12, currently you're required to get 2 MMR vaccines, 2 varicella vaccines, 3 DTaP, Tdap vaccines. Those numbers are put out by CDPH. They're not put in the statute currently. So the COVID vaccine is or COVID disease is being added, and the requirement of a COVID vaccine is being added to the K through 12 or daycare through 12th grade. But it's not clear, and it won't be clear from the statute, how many shots that actually means, what it means to be fully vaccinated, and what cycle that would be on. The interesting thing there is we don't have any other vaccine that's required that isn't set by the CDC, for example. So the standard is 2 shots of MMR vaccine. This one, because we don't know about boosters and how many will be required and whether it's annual, like we don't have a flu vaccine on the schedule, so we don't know how that is going to pan out. The other piece is in the current statute, there is the list of the 10 diseases, and then number 11 states that the California Department of Health can add any vaccine they want through the regulation process, but it has to have a personal belief exemption. That personal belief exemption was put in there in the 2015 legislation because the legislature did not want CDPH to have carte blanche on adding vaccines to the schedule. They wanted to be in control. The legislature wanted to be in control of adding vaccines. So they allowed CDPH to add vaccines, but they had to have a personal belief exemption as kind of an allowance that parents had a way out if CDPH added a vaccine. What Senator Pan has proposed in his legislation is to allow CDPH to still add vaccines, but to remove the personal belief exemption from that criteria. What that means is the legislature if that passes, the legislature will no longer be in charge of adding vaccines to the statute. It will be CDPH that will do that, or can do that. The legislature can also do it, but CDPH can do it without the legislature. That's something that when we're talking to legislators is really important to get them to have them understand, because I don't think the legislators actually want to have that control taken away. It's interesting, in Senator Pan's introduction speech of this bill, he talked about how the Supreme Court had said that, the federal government and OSHA organizations such as OSHA, which are regulatory organizations similar to CDPH, are not the place for these vaccines to be added. It was the state legislatures that should be adding these vaccines. So using his own words, I'm going to say it should be the state legislature adding vaccines. That gives it a democratic process. It gives it 9 months. It gives it committee hearings. It gives time for opposition. Versus the health department, which puts out regulations. They do have to have a 30-day comment period, but it's a comment period. It's not a legislative process. It's not a democratic process per se. So you're, against having the personal belief exemption being removed. And then the hepatitis B vaccine. So this is a really strange section of the current statute. And what it says is that the hepatitis B vaccine is not required for 7th grade entry. It used to be that vaccines were required, or vaccines were checked at kindergarten and at 7th grade. And when they added the hepatitis B vaccine in for kindergarten, they basically said, okay, we're adding it for kindergarten, but you don't have to check it at 7th grade. If the kid doesn't have it at 7th grade, that's okay. They'll get it somewhere along the way, but we want the kindergartners to have that vaccine. That piece of what has happened now, because there is more of a checkpoint at 7th grade, because the medical exemptions and the vaccines have to be checked at 7th grade. Schools are saying, okay, yes, you don't have to have the hepatitis B vaccine in 7th grade. If you were in 1st through 6th grade, you had to have it. And if you're in 8th through 12th grade, you have to have it. And so kids are hitting high school and being told, whose parents had been told, oh, you don't need the hepatitis B vaccine for 7th grade, but they're getting to high school where they check it again, and they're being told by their high schools that you have to have the hepatitis B vaccine. Voice for Droids Advocacy is fine with them taking that statement out. It doesn't make sense anymore in our statute, so it is fine to take that out. It doesn't do anything being in there, because we do have the requirement at kindergarten for them to have the hepatitis B vaccine. So our perspective on this bill is that the biggest piece is it is premature. There is no reason for the COVID vaccine to be added to the childhood schedule. CDPH, if CDPH adds it, that's fine. They can add it and they can take it away relatively easily. So to us, having CDPH add it with a personal belief exemption and some form of what they call in the legislature a sunset date, which means, we're putting it in place for a year and it's required for that year, but after that, it's no longer required. That is the appropriate response right now, because we don't know what is happening with COVID. If you asked me in October, when Senator Wiener announced that he was planning on having this bill and him and Senator Pan were having this bill, I would have said, okay, that's interesting. The COVID vaccine seems to stop transmission for some people. COVID doesn't seem to be rampant in our schools among the vaccinated kids. But, if you look at the last 2 years, things change so often. Every month, every 2 months, we've got different things going on with the virus, with the variants, with the vaccines, with the, all of these things. So we're in a place of instability still, of not knowing what's going to happen with COVID and what's going to happen with the COVID vaccine. We are at a point now where it really doesn't make sense to have a COVID vaccine, because it does nothing for transmission and infection. So vaccinated people are getting infected and are transmitting COVID exactly like unvaccinated people are. And so the vaccine does very little. So why are we mandating this vaccine if it doesn't do anything? And that brings me to the question I ask you to ask your legislators. What is the purpose of this bill? Because I don't understand the purpose of it. And I'd like somebody to explain to me what the purpose of the bill is. If the purpose of the bill is to stop infection and transmission, the vaccine is not the answer. If the purpose is to have the kids have fewer symptoms, they don't have symptoms of COVID. They don't die from COVID. The risk of children getting COVID and anything severe happening to them is extremely low. It's lower than many, many other diseases that we are not doing anything for. So it's not the transmission, it's not the children. So then the last thing that somebody could say to me, it's the community. They are going to help the people that are more likely to get serious adverse events from COVID and serious symptoms and possibly die. That's not up to the children, okay? And the children aren't stopping transmission. So that really doesn't help that elderly person who has comorbidities have any different outcome from COVID if you're vaccinating the children. And so therefore, my question is, what is the purpose of this bill? And that's the question we need to ask our legislators, because I don't think the purpose of this bill, the purpose of the bill that Senator Pan or whoever it is saying doesn't match what needs to happen or what is happening. So what is our response? Again, our response is to strongly oppose unless amended. We don't see the purpose of the bill, and that is our biggest response. But if it is moving through, our 3 requested amendments are to continue to allow the personal belief exemption for CDPH to add vaccines, to include a religious and conscientious belief exemption for the COVID-19 vaccine. That is something that we have not seen before in California. I will go into that in the next slide. And then to allow natural immunity to count in lieu of vaccination. So those are the 3 things that we would ask to be amended to the bill if the bill is moving forward. My recommendation is that you have conversations with your legislators about these things. Doesn't mean to say that you're requesting them right now, but we do recommend you have conversations about them so that when your legislators see this bill, they have it planted in their seeds planted, that these are the things that could be amendments. So I'm going to talk the next couple of slides on the Religious Rights Coalition, because this is one of the key things that we are looking on this bill to do. And then I will open it up for questions. So the Religious Rights Coalition is a coalition that we have put together: A Voice for Choice Advocacy, California Health Coalition Advocacy, and Educate Advocate. And what it does is it will protect the rights of Californians by expanding access to religious and conscious belief exemptions. Our goal is to gather a list of support for the religious and conscientious belief statement, which we can use to impact policy makers at every level of government. So if you have taken my religious exemption writing workshop, or if you haven't, you may know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 grants employees in every state the right to religious accommodations to vaccines that are required as a condition of employment. But this protection is not currently extended to students who attend private and public schools in California. Vaccination status based on religious or conscious beliefs should not be used to exclude students from in-person education or individuals from participating in society. So we want to extend the religious and conscious belief exemption to not just employees, but to students, and to, if you're going into a gym and you're required to show a vaccine card, that you can show your religious exemption instead. The website for this is religiousrightscoalition.org. What we are looking for is for religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and school representatives to sign on to this statement. I'm going to read the statement that we're asking them to sign on to. It says, Article 1 of the California Constitution recognizes every person's right to the free exercise and enjoyment of religion without discrimination or preference, describing this right as a liberty of conscience. I support the rights of families or individuals to make health decisions without coercion, discrimination, or segregation based on religious and conscientious beliefs. This includes the existence of religious and conscientious belief exemptions from required vaccines, with those exempted retaining the ability to fully access, without onerous restrictions, in-person employment, education, public resources, and any other function of society. So our request, you can go to religiousrightscoalition.org, but one of our requests is that you go there and that you ask your religious leaders or religious leaders in your area, or any religious leader that you know, faith-based organizations and school representatives of principals, pastors, superintendents, those types of people, to sign on to this statement. We are looking to get as many as possible so that we can take them to the legislature and ask for a religious exemption and show that there is a want, wish, and will for it in California. So what can you do? This is my last slide before I go to Q&A. What can you do? The number one thing we ask you to do is to make an appointment with your California state senator and your assembly member to discuss SB 866 and SB 871 and any other bills that are coming out. Now, the one thing I will say is when you make that appointment, you may not necessarily say that those are the bills you want to talk about. You may want to choose some other piece of legislation or something else going on in your district that may be of interest to your assembly member. You don't want to do a bait and switch, but you really want to look like a concerned constituent rather than just somebody who's coming in to complain about the vaccine bills. Because I can promise you, you're not going to be favorably looked at just coming in and complaining about the vaccine bill. So you want to build a relationship. It's the reason why we have been saying for the past years, but specifically the past 3 months, please go meet your legislators, build a relationship with them, build a relationship with your staffers, go to their town hall events, go to their public events where they're giving out, over Thanksgiving, it was turkey, toy drives, those types of things. Go to those and meet them and talk to them as a constituent, not as somebody just complaining about the vaccine bills. The second thing that we ask you to do, and especially, there are some people that will do all of these things. There are some people that don't feel comfortable talking to their legislators. So find one thing on this list to do and keep doing it. So the appointment with your legislators. The second thing, as I mentioned, is to ask your religious leaders, faith-based organizations, and school representatives to sign on to the Religious Rights Coalition statement. It is really, really important. We are not going to keep the personal belief exemption if the bill moves through on the COVID vaccine. And so if we can get a religious or a conscientious belief exemption, it means that we have something to work with. The other thing that you can do is go to school board meetings and board of supervisor meetings. Those school boards and the board of supervisors. So the school boards are the place that make the decisions for schools. There are many school boards that are speaking up against this vaccine mandate and have signed resolutions. You don't want to take them a resolution and ask them to just sign it. Most likely they'll want to make their own resolution, but you can give them ideas. Educate Advocate, which is educateadvocateca.com. They have all the list of resolutions that other school boards have signed against the COVID vaccine requirement. Go to your school boards. The key piece there is you want to make sure that you already have your school board votes tallied before you get them to vote on the resolution. You have to have the votes before you ask them to vote on the resolution. The reason behind that is you don't want to get one school board member going, oh yeah, I'll put this resolution forward, no problem, we'll vote on it next time. And then they vote on it and they vote it down, because the other side can then say, oh, see, this school board is in favor of the vaccine mandates. They voted this down. So you want to make sure you have your school board reps. The other piece, and your board of supervisors hires and fires and supervises your county public health director. And so they are really important meetings to go to as well. The other piece, if you have people on the board of supervisors or on the school board that are on our side, they can much more easily get meetings with legislators. And so what another ploy here, or another tactic, is to have school board members and board of supervisors request meetings with legislators to share, and you can share with them the amendments or the analysis of the bill, that type of thing. And you can say to them, would you be willing to go to the legislator and voice your concern? Here are our thoughts on it, but please go tell them to vote no on the bill or abstain on the bill, or put forward amendments. Then the other thing is, if you don't like any of those things and none of those things resonate with you, is talking to other parents and leaders in the community. So getting voices out there talking about this, talking about how we don't need a vaccine mandate, how we don't want 12-year-olds to make decisions, medical decisions. If the parents think that that's fine, think about the slippery slope. If we allow them to make vaccine decisions, what's the next thing that they're going to be allowed to do, make decisions on? So talking to other parents, talking to other leaders in the community. So if you know a board member or somebody who's a CEO of a company or a small business, those people also have clout with legislators. And so they may be able to get meetings with legislators, or may, be friends with the legislator, that they could have sort of an inside meeting with you there or not with you there. But those are key things that right now, this is what we want to be doing. I will say the things not to do are, and I didn't put them up here, but do not just call your legislators or email your legislators. It really does nothing. They get fed up with phone calls. There is a time and place for phone calls. Don't get me wrong. If we're the day before a bill's being heard, we may have a phone campaign, but wait for organizations to say, have a phone campaign. Right now, you don't want to be pissing your legislators off. You need their vote. So we don't want to be pissing them off. We don't want to be using up those resources. If you send an email, that's fabulous, but it goes in their email box and you are a number and a tally, or you get an automated response. It doesn't count as something you've done towards stopping this, but follow the organizations that are really doing the work in California. A Voice for Choice Advocacy and California Health Coalition Advocacy are the only two organizations right now that have lobbyists in the Capitol. It's the reason why I put out an email 3 months ago saying these are the 5 bad bills that we're anticipating. It's because we know things from the inside. I'm happy to, I share that information with the other groups that are out there, and CHCA had the same intel as we did, so we put it out about the same time. But having lobbyists in the Capitol does make a difference. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to go answer some questions. So, how can we include a clause for natural immunity? So, natural immunity is something that is evolving. So, prior to, December, the CDC, nobody here in America recognized natural immunity. What we are seeing more and more is that natural immunity is being addressed and being accepted. The CDC came out last week and said, yep, natural immunity to Omicron with Omicron is the best natural immunity you can get, because it has so many different pieces of different variants in it. But they still said that getting 1 dose of the vaccine was acceptable. Or was better than natural immunity. What's interesting there is that nowhere, like when employees are required to get vaccines, there's nowhere that says, oh, you can have natural immunity in 1 vaccine. The fully vaccinated have to be twice vaccinated and boosted. So it doesn't really make sense. I think natural immunity is evolving, and I think at some point between now and September, we will have a better case for natural immunity on this. Does SB 871 include homeschoolers? It does not include homeschoolers. So that piece of legislation, the statute, does not touch anything that has to do with homeschoolers. So no, it does not. I don't think they will remove that. I don't think they will remove homeschooling or independent study for this, because that's not where they're going with this. If they're going to change stuff for homeschoolers, my guess it will be a bill that addresses homeschooling specifically, not with the vaccine issue. Okay, what about informed consent? The children should be advised of all side effects. Yes, so I'm sorry, yeah, that was one of the requests that we had was, and I actually didn't, it's not in what I presented today, but it is so that the children are given the full package insert, or sorry, they're given the vaccine information statement and the full package insert for the vaccines. If the vaccine information statement they have to have, and the vaccine package insert if they request it, which is what happens with parents. Can you add language in the amendments that private schools would not need to require the COVID vaccines? The whole point of private institution is to be able to run according to their own belief system. I love this question because it is something that we are considering. Now, I know that all public school parents, if we put out an amendment that says private schools should be exempt, are going to go ballistic and be like, well, what about our kids? Just because we don't have the money. It is something that we are considering for various reasons. And so it is something we are considering. Yes, what I will say to those parents in public schools is when that amendment comes forward, all of you need to complain about it being discriminatory and it being, being unequal from a financial perspective, inequity, all of those good words to use. And so my recommendation is, if you see that, don't think that you're being thrown under the bus, but use it as an advantage. That's what happened in New Jersey, and they killed the bill because of that. So it is something we are thinking of, but also from the perspective that you say, which is private schools shouldn't have to follow these requirements. Okay, keep jumping up and down on this. What happened to existing MEs if MEs has statements including any vaccine introduced later? Is there any mention about separating a new medical exemption for COVID vaccines in this new bill? There is not. So, but currently the way the legislation reads, or the statute, not the legislation, the statute reads is that your medical exemption has to list out all the diseases. So any other vaccines isn't included, COVID isn't included in that list. My guess is this is something Senator Pan wanted to keep the bill as simple as possible right now, and that it will be something that will likely be amended or questioned in the process. I think right now, I think it's a very gray area as to whether your medical exemption, if it says any other vaccines, would count for COVID or not. Can we ask them to acknowledge natural immunity? We do this for all other vaccines, chickenpox, etc. So it's an interesting question, because here in California, chickenpox natural immunity is actually not acknowledged for any vaccine. California and Nevada are the only states in the United States that do not acknowledge natural immunity for chickenpox, MMR, and then measles, mumps, rubella. And then there are some states that do more than that, but every other state at least allows natural immunity for those 4 diseases. Now, what's interesting here, and they allow you to bring in either a letter from the doctor saying you had chickenpox, or an antibody test that says, that you have the antibodies, that you have enough antibodies. The interesting, which you can get from just the first vaccine. The interesting thing here, so you can do it here in California, but you need to get a medical exemption to do it. So your doctor can write a medical exemption, put it in the Care ME system, Care Medical Exemption system online, and then it will be accepted. However, the issue is that many of the doctors that allow natural immunity, or for example, they say don't get the chickenpox vaccine, get chickenpox instead, or just do one vaccine and then do titer testing, which is what shows the immunity. Those doctors, many of them have been disciplined because they wrote medical exemptions. And so they have practices where they can't write a medical exemption for immunity, for natural immunity. And in doing so, it goes one further, where these parents are just like, okay, well, I'll go find another doctor just to write the medical exemption. Well, there are no other doctors that will just write the medical exemption for that, because they want the kids, they aren't the children's doctor. And there is a question in the Care ME system that says, are you the child's doctor? And if not, why are you writing this? And they don't want to be witch hunted. And so it is it's a really bad situation here in California. And it is something that we have tried to get natural immunity acknowledged for at least the MMR and chickenpox, and get legislation brought forward, but we haven't been successful in that. Doesn't mean to say that we're not going to try and get it on this with this bill and amend it with this bill. But yes, I think it is something that's definitely, natural immunity is definitely something you should be talking to legislators about. Okay, my child has an autoimmune disease and kids his age were excluded from the COVID vaccine trials. How do they expect me to vaccinate him when they don't know how it affects the kids with his disease and meds, and he won't qualify for a medical exemption per his doctor? I hear you. And my answer is, you're somebody that needs to be talking to your legislator, because this is an issue. It is an issue. The other piece is, people are saying, well, why can they mandate this with the vaccines only being emergency use authorized? So the thought is that by the time January 2023 rolls around, they will all be FDA approved. Having said that, they will not be done with their clinical trials. I agree with you. I was having this conversation with my child's principal, and she said, you need to get a new medical exemption. And my answer was, well, how can I get that medical exemption when my kids' issues are autoimmune, and we have no, we're not going to see that data for another 5 years as to what happens. And so, there isn't a way I can get a medical exemption because of that. So similar to you. So it is a conversation that we have to have with our legislators, and it's part of the conversation why this is just too premature. Okay. How do we as citizens ask the committee to review the current data? So if it were anyone else in this committee, I would have hope that you could go to them with science. And they do say that they are talking to experts about the science, but it is very hard to get committees to hear the other side. Committees will put on hearings, informational hearings, but they get to choose who speaks at those informational hearings. You can give public comment, but honestly, it doesn't really get through. There was a vaccine safety working group, California, actually it was West Coast, so it included California, Oregon, et cetera, and we tried to submit things to them and they weren't interested in them. We had doctors and other people submit them. There are a few people in California that I think need to step up a bit more. And they are the doctors and the well-known doctors that are for vaccines, but against these mandates. So people like Vinod Prasai, that's how you say his name, and other of the Stanford doctors that have spoken out throughout COVID on this issue, and specifically spoken out against children getting vaccines. So I look to them to take a little bit more of a stand on this, because that would help us. Okay, if these bills go through, when do they go into effect? Earliest January 2023. Yes, so a bill that's one thing I didn't mention. So a bill that goes into the legislative process now goes, if it is signed, goes into effect January 1st, 2023, or January 1st of the following year. Other than there are two things that don't do that. If there is a supermajority vote on it, so if it gets a 2/3 vote, then it can go into effect immediately. And the other thing is if the bill says something different. So for example, our Menstrual Product Rights to Know Act was passed in 2020, but only is going into effect either 2022 or 2023. So to give time for like the manufacturers to add ingredients to their labels, that type of thing. So it depends. It may say that the vaccine requirement doesn't go into effect until the 2023-24 school year. But having said that, I could also see them not doing it and saying January is the cutoff, because CDPH will have put through the requirement with the personal belief exemption, earlier than that. And so I could see them saying, well, it's only the people that have the personal belief exemption. They have, until January to work out what they're going to do with their schooling. So we're going to implement it in January. I think there's a 50-50 chance. Right now it's being implemented in January. I think there's a 50-50 chance that may change to the next school year rather than this school year. And then somebody asked the age amendment for the minors. Do you think asking for 16 might result in them battering it down to 14? What if we ask for 17 instead? We consider that. I think that I think there's enough psychological data to say that 14 also doesn't work. Could it happen? Yes, it could happen. But I think our arguments are based on more solid science if we go with 16. 17 doesn't really, doesn't really do anything. 16 is also the age that you can become an emancipated minor, which is another argument to use. Does this bill require the shot for kids who are attending independent study fully online with the public school? It does not. Independent study is exempt from it. Will this bill reach beyond daycare through 12? For example, college students? Thank you. So our universities follow the lead of K through 12, and this is true for every state. So in states where there's a personal belief exemption, you can have a personal belief exemption for colleges and universities in that state. It's not written into law in most places, but that's just what they do. So here in California, when SB 277 was passed and removed the personal belief exemption, the University of California the following year removed they didn't have any vaccine requirements going into the University of California if you were a domestic student, but they added the vaccine requirements, and that you had a medical exemption only, other than for the COVID and the flu vaccines, which have a religious exemption associated with them. The reason those two have religious exemptions is because in 2020, the University of California added the flu vaccine mandate, and they required students and staff to get vaccinated for the flu. And they allowed a religious exemption, which they had to do for for staff, and they didn't give a religious exemption for students. And at that time, A Voice for Choice Advocacy, as well as a few other organizations, lobbied them hard and said, you have to give, if you're going to have the same policy, you have to have the same exemption. So you have to have a religious exemption for the flu vaccine. And so they added a religious exemption for the flu vaccine, and then they did that as well for COVID. Having said that, if the flu vaccine is required of students K through 12, I think the COVID or the flu vaccine, I think the university would still look at whether they're going to require their staff to be vaccinated. And I think they would keep the religious exemption for that. But for other vaccines, they don't have a religious exemption. Okay, next question. For your Voice for Choice advocacy response of SB 866 slide, could you please clarify the bullet number 3 that wants to require vaccine providers to obtain complete medical history and physical exam first? I am not comfortable with a nurse in a COVID vaccine clinic having access to my child's entire medical file. This is personal medical information. I'm afraid if you ask for the amendment to be added, it gives more control of these COVID clinics to invade our privacy more than children has even less medical privacy, because now school clinics would get to see all of the children's history. Do they get access to the medical history without parental permission? What about Hipaa? I do not want any vaccine provider having any access to my child's medical history that is private information. So it's a good point. It is where we're going with this, kind of. So the key piece here, we put that in because in order to get a medical exemption, it is very clear in the statute, so it sets precedence in the statute currently, that a doctor giving a medical exemption has to do a complete physical, has to get medical history from the children's previous physicians, and basically has to take that child on and understand the child's history in detail in order to give them a medical exemption. That is something that the doctors that were writing medical exemptions, most of them did that, but some of them didn't. And that's part of why they have lost had their medical exemption, their medical licenses revoked or disciplined. Now, you're right, Hipaa falls in here. So for Hipaa, for your medical records to be released, you have to get consent. For a child, that consent has to be given by the parent, one of the two parents. So it would require the parent to have knowledge that the person was getting that medical information. You can also say that certain medical information is allowed to be shared and other medical information is not allowed to be shared. Our biggest piece in this is that if it is somebody other than the pediatrician, your child's pediatrician that is giving this vaccine, they honestly are not going to go to the effort to do this. They would prefer to just not vaccinate the child than to have to go through all of this rigmarole. But if they are going to go and do it, then they better have the history from that child, and they better know whether that child had reactions, whether that child is allergic to something, whether that child, has myocarditis, whether that child has cancer, whatever it is, because that child isn't necessarily going to tell them that. So I see your point. It is two-sided, but we are not concerned with, we're not that concerned with medical records being distributed here, there, and everywhere. Okay, I would like to have mandatory autopsies required for those that die shortly after vaccination. Also make vaccine makers liable for injury. So those are two wonderful suggestions, but they are close to impossible to pass through. So having autopsies is a huge expense. And so the state won't agree to that. And they also don't want you to really know what happens to the person or has happened to the person. And then having the vaccine makers liable for injury, I absolutely 100%. It would mean reversing the National Children's Vaccine Program in that act, which was passed in 1986. If there is any way we could do that, I promise you there are so many people that are working and wanting to make that happen, but it would need a bill in Congress to reverse that. And I can promise you Congress is heavily lobbied by the pharmaceutical industry more than any other industry. They lobby and give money, twice as much money to Washington, D.C. legislators as they do as any other lobby there. So it is something that would be wonderful, but it just in the way our democracy works right now, or doesn't work, it is not something that is likely to happen. Okay, next question. If this pandemic is deemed an endemic, could that change anything? Absolutely. So I am expecting in the next 2-3 weeks, I think mid-February, I'm just looking at the date where we are today. I think mid-February, I think Newsom will change this to an endemic. I think the real question is, what does he actually change? How much is it going to change? Is it going to be like Boris Johnson in the UK, who basically said, we're getting rid of masks, we're getting rid of vaccine requirements, we're getting rid of everything. You can wear a mask if you want to, but that is your responsibility. It's amazing to hear those words come out of his mouth. I do think that there is a global shift in the narrative to that. Spain and other countries in Europe have said that that's the direction they're moving into. So I wouldn't be surprised if it happens here in California. If it does, it helps our case, because it helps and it hurts us. There's a piece where it helps us because, schools no longer have to require vaccines, or they haven't required vaccines, but they no longer have to require masks or anything else. And so the vaccines kind of fall into that. The place where it hurts us is if there is another variant of the vaccine, or a vaccine that actually can stop transmission, then that would be a perfect thing to say, well, we don't need any of these other things because people are vaccinated, because there's this new vaccine. So I think it will change something. I think it will change the narrative. So yes. If a child becomes vaccine injured because of school mandates, can the school be held liable instead of the pharmaceutical companies or not? So the answer to that is yes, they could. The key piece there, and we have tried to see if we could find litigants for this. The key piece there is it has to be absolutely obvious that your child had the vaccine and the injury was caused by the vaccine, that it was causation and not correlation. And if that happens, you could sue the school, but it is incredibly difficult to show that piece of it. You would have to have it documented by ER staff, nurses, doctors, that kind of thing. And they don't report it. If you ask any vaccine injured parent, you ask them to look at their vaccine or their medical history of their child, it is very, very rarely reported. So if you have all of that, then yes. Mainly how to get numbers of deaths and serious injuries and victims' faces and stories out to the public on a daily, weekly, public basis. So I think it's very, very hard to do that because of the censorship. So it is, I personally believe it's not mass media that gets us there. It's each of us. There are how many people? There's over 600 people on this call, and there's going to be thousands more that watch this. If each of us talk to 10 people, just do the multiplier by that. It's you're talking to people. It's you. It's you who needs to do something. If you want to make this change, it's all of the people on these calls, all of the people that are concerned with this. You have to do something. You cannot sit behind a computer and just click on things or share things on social media or anything else, because it doesn't help what we're doing. You have to get out and actually physically do something to make change. How would the mandate work if current vaccine doesn't work for the latest virus mutation? Are all boosters automatically mandates, such as a yearly booster? If the future mutation doesn't have a vaccine developed, how would that affect the mandate? In other words, would the law demand a vaccine even if it's proven not to work for future versions? Would this be an angle or question in this bill? And what are the chances of lawmakers that will ask these questions in upcoming hearings? So 2 different questions there. So I was having a conversation with somebody, a reporter today, and this was one of the things that came up. And I said to her, for these variants, there is no way that a vaccine would be available. Even if we squeezed everything out of it and rushed it to market, that it wouldn't be available for 3 months after the variant is identified. You take something like Omicron, it was identified in November, late December, early December. 3 months later, Omicron's already done. So the vaccine, even if it was a Omicron specific vaccine booster, it would do nothing right now. It may get a few people, but it wouldn't do very much. So we're always going to be behind the boosters, behind the latest variant. It's the same thing that happens with the flu vaccine, right? So the flu vaccine is based on the last year's variants and what they predict the next year's variants will be. But the flu vaccine is never more than 50% efficacious. And usually, many times it's down in the teens as how effective it is. So this, as I mentioned, this piece of legislation does not address any of that. Where that falls is into the Department of Public Health. They will put the regulations together that define what that looks like, and we have no idea what that will be. It also will be up to them. So it takes it out of the legislature's hands. So it is something that I think we should bring up to legislators, because I would like it to be defined, because I trust CDPH less than I trust our legislators, but I feel like it should be defined by the legislature as to what that looks like, and what prompts a booster being required versus not being required. So I would do that. The other question was, how likely is it to have lawmakers ask these questions? So that's where your relationship with your legislature is so important. Legislators listen to their constituents. The questions that we have had asked in hearings are questions that have been brought many times by their constituents. I can think of at least 3 critical questions that were asked in hearings by legislators that were because their constituents said, what about this question? So it is really, really important. That's a place where you can absolutely make a difference. And you can ask them, if you don't know the answer to this question, could you ask it in the hearing so that that the author is made to answer the question? Okay. What are the chances of these bills actually passing? I would say extremely good. I mean, I'm close to 100% that the bill will pass. What the bill actually says by the end of it is a whole nother story. So that I think this is Senator Pan's last year. He is going to go out with a bang, and I don't see that any of these bills won't make it to the governor's desk. If they don't, fabulous. It's close to a miracle. Unless a large organization, like for example, if the CMA, if the California Medical Association was opposed to one of these bills, then it wouldn't pass. But if they are, or maybe the California Teachers Association even, or LAUSD, for example, if any of them are against the bill, then it has a chance of not moving forward. But given that I'm pretty sure the vaccine group has gotten the CMA's approval of all of them, I don't think that is likely to happen. So I think these bills will get to the governor's desk. As I said, the real question is, what do they look like on the governor's desk? I think they will be very different from what they are now. I hope they are. When the package insert is still left blank under the EUA approval, how can they mandate the jabs without informed consent available? So these vaccines, when these mandates happen, the vaccines will be fully authorized, fully approved by the FDA. So it is likely that the 12 to 17-year-olds, or the 16-year-olds already, the 12 to 16-year-olds are approved in the next couple of months, and I think the 5 to 11-year-olds will be approved by September. I hear that if there is a treatment for disease, unauthorized vaccines have to be withdrawn. So it's a questionable piece here. So they should, the emergency use authorized vaccines should not be on the market if there is an alternative treatment. Now, there's been an alternative treatment since the beginning of this, and they were still put on the market. The issue is that the vaccines have been, the Pfizer vaccine, for example, has been approved. It will be approved for all ages 5 and up in the next few months. So it kind of becomes a moot point because once they're FDA approved, that no longer applies. In terms of timeline, I read Pan's bill could go into effect as soon as this fall. It cannot go into effect as soon as this fall. It can only go into effect this fall if he had a 2/3 majority, and he doesn't have a 2/3 majority on it. So his bill will go into effect in January. What will go into effect in the fall is CDPH, is the California Department of Public Health, them putting a regulation in, but that would allow a personal belief exemption. One thing on the personal belief exemption that you have to be aware of, it is most likely going to be a similar form to the personal belief exemption that was used between 2013 and 2016. Which required a physician signature on it. The physician signature just is them stating that they have told you the risks of the disease and the benefits of the vaccine. And you don't have to agree with them. They don't have to agree with you, but they have to sign the piece of paper. Many doctors are not willing to sign that now because they feel it's like a personal belief like a medical exemption. And so they're worried that they're going to be witch hunted because of it. But I would say I'm hoping that is another thing that we're going to, when that form comes out, if that is the case, it's something that we need to address, and we will be addressing. Is it helpful to go in small groups to meet with legislators? Yes and no. So yes, it is, because it gives you somebody else. If you go with other people, make sure that those other people are on track and you're all having the same request, that somebody doesn't, go off track, and make sure that you know exactly what you are going to be talking about in that meeting and what the other people are going to be talking about, and that you've allocated that. So if you have 5 points and you have 5 people, give each person a point, or give one person, make one person the spokesperson, and then the other people kind of fill in with other pieces of information. But you want it to be strategic and well planned. The worst thing is you usually only get somewhere between 15 minutes and half an hour at the most with the legislator or with their staffer. When you're going with that time frame, if you have somebody that just starts talking and they keep on talking and they keep on talking and they go off on tangents and they don't give any of the information you wanted to give the legislator, it happens. It's happened to me. It happens to everyone. So make sure the people that you go to, that you trust them, you know what you've worked out ahead of time, who's going to say what, then by all means go in small groups. The other piece that the legislators on these bills that don't want to deal with the people, they will meet with one group, or they'll combine groups. It may be that they have two groups that they have said, oh yeah, we'll meet you at 10 o'clock and we're going to invite this other group that has similar concerns to come at 10 o'clock too. That means you're now got two groups that are sort of trying to get same time. But the other thing that the legislators sometimes do is say, okay, yeah, we've already met with constituents. We don't need to meet with you because we've heard the constituents' concerns and they sound similar to yours. And then they blow you off. So my recommendation is the best thing to do is to try and meet them at one of their events and to ask them, could I have a meeting with you? And then to either go by yourself or go with a small group that knows their talking points. Does the bill apply to outside activities for kids like sports and choir? It does not, and it never has. So vaccine requirements have never been for after school activities, which is really interesting because many schools have implemented COVID vaccine requirements or stricter COVID requirements for after school activities. And they have kind of gotten away with it in many cases, but the bill does not actually apply to that. The interesting thing is if it went into effect, does it now preclude schools from being able to require it for sports and choir, which is the case with the other vaccines, the other diseases, because the law only applies to K through 12 or daycare through 12. So it'll be interesting to see how that works, but the law does not cover extracurricular activities right now. What happens if the bill passes? Can we fight it? So once legislation passes, it is incredibly hard to change. There are three ways of changing it. One, you can have a referendum. A referendum, basically, you have to get enough signatures, put it on the ballot. We do not recommend a referendum on any bill. The reason behind it is it was tried in SB 277 in 2015. Number one, it is really, really hard and expensive to get the signatures. It takes a lot out of people. If you got that money to put towards signature collection, I can tell you it costs about $2 million. If you have that money, I have better places for you to spend it to fight this. So a referendum, and then a referendum puts it on the ballot. So it then becomes part of a general election. I can guarantee you that it will not pass on the ballot. We saw that happen in Maine. In Maine, they did get it on the ballot. They got enough signatures and it was pushed down. And that makes it even worse because then the legislature can say the people have voted and the people have voted that we should have this vaccine requirement. If you take referendums are similar to initiatives. If you take initiatives in California, we have 3 initiatives that failed that should have passed in California. One of them was gay rights, gay marriage. One of them was GMO labeling, and one of them was the gas tax. If none of those could get passed in California, I can promise you a vaccine requirement is not going to go down the toilet with a referendum or initiative. The second way of doing it is to reverse the legislation in the legislature. That takes years. It doesn't matter how good an argument you have, unless there is a movement. So, unless you have a Me Too movement or something that is so profound and significant that can make a change, it is unlikely to be changed in the legislature. And the third way is courts. We had a Voice of Choice Advocacy and 3 other groups had court cases against SB 277, and none of them got anywhere because the court system in California is about as biased as the legislative system. It should not be, but in California, the judges believe in the greater good and public health way over parents' rights or school or education rights. It doesn't mean to say there won't be lawsuits on this. I think there will. I'm pretty sure we will have a lawsuit on it if it does pass. But we had a lawsuit. We didn't take it to the Supreme Court because at that time the Supreme Court was not conducive to us, and we would have gotten a bad precedent if they even heard our case Only 5% of cases that make it to the Supreme Court are actually heard by the Supreme Court. But if we got there, the likelihood was that they would push it down, or put it down. They would vote against rule against it. Having said that, right now the Supreme Court is to our advantage, and so I think we are likely to bring legislation, bring legal cases forward if it does go through. I am beginning to think that Senator Pan gets any bill passed that he wishes. What options do parents have if they do not want their children vaccinated with COVID vaccines and want them to attend school? I agree with you on Senator Pan. He is incredibly powerful because of the position he holds in various committees. And he has the CMA, the California Medical Association, behind him. And that is incredibly powerful. It is completely a corrupt system, yes. What options do you have? You really don't have any options if this bill passes. The key question will be whether schools will rise up and not go along with it. There are many schools that have said that they won't go along with it and that they will not implement it. But when push comes to shove, when their funding gets held, or when their school gets warrants put out on them, will schools actually hold the line? And so that's why it is so important for these bills not to pass as they are currently written. You can do more now than you can once it passes. Since legislatures, namely Pan, don't actually care about our kids or the science, is an angle to pursue here the loss of funding when there's a mass exodus out of schools. California schools dropped in enrollment by over 60,000 kids last year, probably because of the gross mishandling of California COVID in schools. Losing kids means losing funding. That make them care. Thoughts on that angle? Absolutely 100%. So I think the two angles of that are funding, but then also, and it's specifically tied to enrollment of children. And then the other piece of it is the stress on the system when all of these children go to independent study, because they're not going to go to pure homeschooling most likely. And that's part of the reason why, for example, LAUSD postponed their implementation, because there were 34,000 kids that didn't get vaccinated and were not going to get vaccinated, and they didn't have the room in their independent study. They have a very large online virtual school called City of Angels, and they moved all of their unvaccinated teachers over there. So it's not that they don't have teachers, but they didn't have the capacity and didn't want to have 34,000 kids move to online learning. So I think there is pressure there by all means. I think there are some bills that will come up this year that will change how schools get their funding. So for example, there is a bill that is looking to remove the ADA, the daily attendance, and do it on enrollment rather than on attendance. I think they could also say that if you're in independent study through the public school system, you're not actually losing them money because they are still getting funding for your independent study child. I think if parents say they're going to fully homeschool their kids or they're going to move out of state, then yes, there is a stress factor on that. The other downside of that is right now we are in an incredible budget windfall, and a lot of that money is going to schools. So right now they're not going to see the big impact of kids leaving, but they are going to see it in years to come. Would it help to publicize Pan's monetary relationships with pharma to help this matter? So that happened in 2015 and it didn't mean anything at all. What you have to realize is that all legislators and all legislators in California take money from some interest group. So there is not a legislature, there are very, very few, I should say, there are some that don't take money from interest groups. And so the fact that Pan takes money from pharma, you're not going to get another legislator calling him out on that because they're taking money from oil and gas or from, wherever else. So it's really hard to use that argument. People look at it and go, yeah, okay, fine. He got, in 2015, he got $98,000 from the pharmaceutical, healthcare industry. Okay, that's just how it works in California. So, I think I don't think it helps on that front. once we get an appointment with the legislator, what are the main talking points discussed on the bills? So we will be putting out a flyer with those main talking points. We've written our letters of opposition on the 2 bills that have been introduced, but a Voice for Choice Advocacy will be putting out talking points. Somebody asked, and I'll answer this as the last one. Can you explain the point of lobbyists? Why would you have a lobbyist? So I agree with that question. So in 2015, this will be my last answer. In 2015, we went up to the Capitol in thousands, and we thought we could stop this bill. We had the first hearing, and it literally took hours and hours to say our names and oppose the bill. Interestingly, in California, just a side note, in a hearing, you don't have, as an individual, you don't have the ability to say anything but whether you're opposing, supporting the bill, your name, and any affiliation you're with. In somewhere like Colorado, you get 3 minutes. Every single person gets 3 minutes to speak. So it is much more of a democracy than we are here in California. But side note, so we went up there, second hearing, we were all sitting there. It was the education hearing. Senator Liu was the chair. And Senator Pan did not have the votes. He did not have the votes that day. And we were all sitting there going, yes, we beat this bill. We beat it. We did it. Yes, we can go home and we're done. And the chair of the committee looked at Pan and said, you don't have the votes here. Would you like to postpone the vote for a week so that you can answer our questions? And he turned to his lobbyist, the CMA lobbyist, and they had a conversation, and he said, yes, I would. And so they waited another week. All of us, thousands of people, got up, went home, did our thing, came back, and he had basically gotten the votes over that week. And what I realized sitting there was, we don't know what we're doing here. We as individuals don't have any clue what we're doing here. And so I talked to people in Washington, I talked to people in Illinois, I talked to people at NVIC, the National Vaccine Information Center. And I was just like, what are we doing? What do we need to be doing? And every single one of them said, you need a lobbyist, because you cannot get in the doors. It doesn't matter what you say, you cannot get in those doors and have meetings with legislators without a lobbyist. And it's unfortunate. My lobbyists know this, they hear me say it, that I don't like lobbyists. I don't feel that we should have to pay for our words to be heard, but it is the only way that building works. You can have meetings. Individual constituent meetings are so important. They're not less important, but they're important on a local district level. Like, you need to meet your legislators in their district. You need to show that you are somebody who votes and votes for them. But it is very, very hard to find a lobbyist that will pick this issue up, because most of them are already indebted to pharma or want to be indebted to pharma at some point in the future. Most of them don't want to take on this issue because it is such a volatile issue, and they're worried. I found a lobbyist, and she started with us as it moved into the assembly, and it was honestly too little too late. But I spent every Monday through Wednesday in Sacramento that legislative year, and I just followed her around, and I went to meetings, and I worked out how that building worked. And it's part of the reason in 2019, my goal coming out of 2015 was, if there is another bill like this, that we hire as many lobbyists as we can, because the CMA has 8 lobbyists working on this. They put $2 million against us. When you have 8 lobbyists, when we come in and say, oh, this is an issue, you need to be concerned about this issue, they are in that room 2 hours later and making the counter argument, and they've got the money. So it is an unfair process, but without lobbyists in the building, we would be even worse off. So in 2019, a Voice for Choice Advocacy hired 3 lobbyists. There was CHCA had 1 lobbyist, and there were 2 other lobbyists working on the issue on our side. And I have to say, we made incredible inroads in 2019. We had over 30 Democrat legislators that held off the bill or voted no on the bill. That was a huge win. Pan only had 42 votes in the last vote and he needed 41. So it really, it really was a change. And I see the benefit of lobbyists. I also see the benefit of lobbyists. I and CHCA, Voice for Choice Advocacy and CHCA, put out what these bills were. back in October, November. We told, we put it out there, these bills are coming. And so there is an advantage of lobbyists. They are expensive. The way we look at it is, if we have time, money, and effort, right? Those are the three things that we can expend energy on, or expend. Time, our time, your time; money, our money, your money; and effort. Where do we put that time, money, and effort? And a Voice for Choice Advocacy has decided that having lobbyists in the building is where we put a lot of our time, money, and effort. But it doesn't mean to say that we don't do other things. So anyway, that was, I went over a little bit. I hope that was helpful for people. I will say, if you want to do anything and you appreciate the work we're doing, I would ask that you give a donation to a Voice for Choice Advocacy. That is the only way that we do it. I do not get paid anything from the work I do. I do this all for the love of it and the passion of it. But we have hired a staff, and we do have lobbyists, and we do have to fund them. And it's only through your donations that we do that. So if you want to donate, you can go to avoiceforchoiceadvocacy.org/donate. And thank you to the people. I noticed there were some that were monthly donations. We incredibly appreciate our monthly donors as well, or any large donations, because they help us forecast for the next part of the year. So thank you so much, and good night. And we will make it through this year. Just remember, it's a marathon, not a sprint. All right, take care, and take care of yourselves. Bye.